The wind over the western plains wasn't just cold. It was a sort of philosophical cold, the kind that made a person reconsider all their life decisions while trying to break through half-frozen butter with the back of a wooden spoon. In the winter of 1872, somewhere between what is now Wyoming and a vague sense of regret, pioneers trudged through the brittle landscape in search of something better, usually land, sometimes freedom, and occasionally just somewhere warmer with fewer wolves. Pioneer life wasn't glamorous. It was parts courage, parts cabbage, and several parts extremely bad timing. Little wooden cabins sprouted across the vast nothingness like wooden stumps after a very optimistic forest fire. Constructed with more hope than insulation, these homes were a wooden shrug against the brutal weather, grateful for heat when it came, but otherwise resigned to the slow art of freezing gracefully while still trying to churn butter. Take, for example, Isaiah and Maribel Delaney, two names I've just now assigned to a very real statistical average of pioneer couples. They'd packed up their worldly possessions, mostly consisting of a skillet, a hymnal, and 3 jars of suspiciously persistent pickles, and boarded a creaking prairie schooner headed west. The word schooner sounded romantic. The reality was more like riding a wheelbarrow through a thunderstorm for 6 months, with a squeaky axle and a goat named Prudence who refused to budge in the mornings. By December, they'd found what the federal land surveyor generously called a prime homestead opportunity, but which Isaiah lovingly referred to as the only place where the wind doesn't actively slap you in one direction. They staked their claim, built their cabin with an alarming lack of nails, and hunkered down for the season armed with hope, a single wool blanket, and the belief that porridge could, in fact, fill emotional as well as physical needs. Ah, yes, porridge. Pioneer cuisine was less a culinary tradition and more a string of increasingly grim compromises. Porridge for breakfast, porridge with potato peelings for lunch, and surprise, it's porridge with molasses for dinner. If appropriately seasoned with tears and available boot leather, it could almost pass for stew. It wasn't unusual for entire families to rotate hats to keep warm indoors, or for someone to say sentences like, "This draft is extra philosophical today." Dinner time was especially poetic. Family members would crowd around a cast iron stove that had all the charm of an irritable grandfather and only slightly more heat output. It burned whatever was thrown at it, sometimes wood, sometimes dung, and occasionally Maribel's patience. The stove was the heart of the home, and like many hearts, it sputtered and smoked and was surprisingly good at keeping secrets, like the number of squirrels inadvertently roasted by accident. Much of a pioneer's energy was spent preparing for the winter that never quite ended. Chopping wood became less a task and more a lifestyle. Chapped hands were part of the wardrobe, and the phrase "store-bought" was tried once, laughed at, and never mentioned again. You didn't buy things. You bartered, traded, whittled, or invented new versions of those things using leftover wagon parts, dried apples, and enough prairie ingenuity to qualify as wizardry. At night, when the wind howled like a lonely accordion player in a thunderstorm, families would huddle under quilts and swap stories. Lacking electricity, television, or even the comfort of cell service to check if anyone else felt this temperature in their bones, they made do with imagination. They told tales of East Coast cities with gas lamps and streetcars, of European ancestors who presumably lived in castles, and of the future, where surely someone would invent a better way to keep your feet warm than repeatedly stepping into buckets of heated cornmeal. And, somehow, through all that cold and snow and porridge fatigue, the pioneers endured. They weren't always cheerful about it, mind you, but they endured with a certain kind of grit, the fuel of every quietly heroic life that doesn't get remembered in history books, but should be. The kind of life where cracking open a frozen biscuit without it turning to dust was considered a small but deeply meaningful triumph. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now, gently let the cold winds wander past your door as we tiptoe further along this long, frostbitten trail. Curl up tight. There are more footsteps to follow. As the curtain of dust draped itself gently over the western horizon, the pioneers would begin what can only be described as their nightly performance of the Great Quilt Shuffle. Every settler, family, from Dakota Territory to Oregon country, had perfected the sacred act of piling 6 to 12 patches of hand-stitched warmth onto themselves until they could neither move nor get out of bed without a chisel. Now, before you imagine them cozily sipping cocoa in a log cabin illuminated by firelight, let's clarify. Cocoa was a rare imported luxury, often reserved for Sundays, funerals, or when someone got bit by a snake and needed cheering up. What they actually drank was more likely hot water flavored with dried bark or hope. Sometimes both. The cabins themselves were, let's say, motivational structures. Drafts blew through the walls with the enthusiasm of unpaid interns, and insulation came courtesy of whatever livestock hair had been swept from the floorboards. Still, the pioneers persevered with a tenacity born out of necessity and passive-aggressive neighbors who had already survived one more winter than you had. They slept in what can be generously called beds, stuffed not with down feathers, but straw, corn husks, or the flattened regrets of westward expansion. The mattresses were roped together in an art form that required regular tightening, hence the origin of the phrase "sleep tight." Seriously, that wasn't just a sweet send-off. It was survival advice from people who woke up with their spines shaped like macaroni. Speaking of sleeping arrangements, privacy was a concept the prairie hadn't invented yet. Entire families, not to mention the occasional goat, or that guy named Cousin Elmer who forgot to leave after visiting from Omaha, piled into a single room. Children were tucked against the walls like they were part of the architecture, while adults claimed the bed, though there was an unspoken understanding that anyone under 50 didn't really need to sit upright in the morning. And yes, on particularly fierce winter nights, cowboys and frontiersfolk would sometimes sleep with their livestock. Chickens, if you were lucky. A pig, if you were practical. And a horse, only if things had gotten so desperate that dignity had relocated to a warmer climate. But lest you think it was all suffering and sad soup, let's remember this was a time when people made their own entertainment. And that entertainment, surprisingly, often involved something called a warming stone. Imagine taking a rock, heating it in a fire for half the day, wrapping it in flannel, and confidently placing it at the foot of your bed as if it were a heated mattress pad from a frontier hammocker schlemmer. Settlers adored their warming stones almost as much as their families. In some cases, more. In the absence of central heating, body heat became communal property. After the stone lost its glow and the fire burned low, the sharp cold would sneak in through the floorboards like a minor character in a Russian novel. But the family, a tangle of limbs, patchwork quilts, and the soothing drift of snores, would generate an ecosystem of collective warmth usually only achieved by penguins or theatre audiences watching 3-hour tragedies. Outside, winds howled over the snowdrifts, with all the elegance of someone arguing with a flagpole. But inside, there was a particular peace, the kind of quiet only found when everyone is too exhausted to complain and too frozen to do anything about it. In this stillness, night wrapped its velvet arms around the land, and the people tucked themselves deeper into dreams of springtime, of green shoots, fresh rain, and maybe, just maybe, an indoor toilet. Sleep on the frontier was not just a necessity, it was a ritual, an act of defiance against the frigid unknown. And even though they never had weighted blankets or sleep apps promising 8 hours of Icelandic ocean sounds, they found their way to slumber just the same. And as they began to drift, one by one, beneath layers of calico quilts and a shared sense of pioneer optimism, their dreams would sometimes wander beyond mere survival, to the tools that would ease the burden, the skills that could tame the cold, and the quiet wonders hiding in the art of making do. Tools not made of steel, but of hands and borrowed warmth, and maybe a surprising amount of salt, which, come to think of it, reminds me of something rather curious about their pantry shelves. When the snow began to whisper across the plains, the homesteaders of the Wild West turned their thoughts inward. Not metaphorically, we mean quite literally inward, into their houses, sod huts, and repurposed root cellars, where they would spend much of winter wrapped in whatever warmth could be hijacked from buffalo hides, cast iron stoves, and the questionable effectiveness of multi-generational body heat. You might picture the pioneer home as a rustic hallmark scene. Wooden walls adorned with dried herbs, rocking chairs creaking near a hearth, a pie possibly cooling on a windowsill while a grandmother hums something twangy. And while that's mostly cinematic nonsense, it's not entirely off. There were herbs, creaking chairs, and maybe even a pie, if you could afford enough lard, apples, and hope. But combine that hallmark vision with 6 kids, 2 goats, frost on the inside of your windows, and the daily existential crisis of whether the potatoes would last until February, and you're a bit closer to the real flavor of pioneer domestic life during winter's deep freeze. Now, let's ease into one of the most essential and irrationally romanticized elements of cold season pioneer survival: the homestead bed. For many settlers, furniture was less about fashion and more about physics. Could it hold weight? Could it be assembled from whatever wood hadn't already been burned to make tea water that morning? And could it double as something else? A dining bench, a baby corral, perhaps a firm suggestion of privacy. Most beds were, in fact, not beds at all, but were rather straw-stuffed sacks plopped on planks, or even rolled out like a particularly itchy burrito on the hard-packed earth floor. Mattresses, if they were lucky enough to have one, needed fluffing every few weeks to redistribute the straw, mouse droppings, and crushed dreams evenly. Piling bodies into the bed was not always a choice, but a necessity. The human body being a surprisingly affordable source of heat. A typical family might sleep 8 or more to a straw tick, all huddled together like spoons in a drawer. No, it wasn't comfortable. Yes, someone usually kicked someone else. And yes again, somebody, usually the goat, always snored. In the absence of modern insulation, pioneers depended on what's politely known as ingenuity, and less politely as winging it with quilts. Quilts were not just bedding, they were heirlooms, insulation, statements of love, and, on truly desperate nights, doors. They hung over windows, partitioned sleeping areas, and if the fire went out too early, might be found wrapped around the entire family like a fabric tortilla of survival. Of course, Staying warm wasn't only about sleeping arrangements. There was the twilight art of fire maintenance, a delicate, smoky ballet performed around a stove called either Old Reliable or that soot-faced liar, depending on its mood. Keeping the fire going all night involved stacking logs just so, whispering fervent hopes, and inevitably waking up in the wee hours because someone forgot to close the flue, and the room now featured a refreshing indoor snowdrift. Water froze in morning buckets. Soap bars turned to granite. And chamber pots, yes, the romanticism wanes quickly, required courage, steady aim, and an unshakable belief that dignity was adaptable. But it wasn't all misery. Winter's slower rhythm provided rare time for storytelling, mending, and a rather suspicious amount of whittling. Every pioneer child learned to tolerate adult tales about how cold it got in '74, delivered between sips of tepid sassafras tea, interrupted only by the sound of another button popping off a waistcoat or a floorboard, groaning alarmingly under the dog. Even during those glacial months, humor survived, quietly, like a coyote circling the edge of the firelight. Jokes were often born from necessity. If you had to break ice to wash your face, you might as well laugh about it before your eyebrows froze. And so, between gusts of blizzard wind, creaking walls, and the ceaseless war against frostbite, pioneers found a kind of rhythm. Not polished or particularly graceful, but enduring. Like a snowflake landing on weathered leather, melting just long enough to remind them that spring, though fashionably late, always RSVPs eventually. Which brings us to something every pioneer secretly cherished, no matter how rough their winter got: a proper cup of frontier coffee. But that particular brew, and its, shall we say, inventive preparation, deserves its own fireside moment. In the winters of the Wild West, while adventure novels would have us believe that everyone was out dueling desperados or chasing tumbleweeds into dramatic sunsets, actual pioneer life looked a lot more like staying indoors and desperately trying not to freeze one's molars into cubes of regret. There was, however, one radiant hearth at the center of it all. Literally, the wood-burning stove, possibly the most beloved family member in any frontier home. And unlike your Uncle Bert who tells dubious stories at Thanksgiving, the stove's warmth was welcome and mostly reliable, assuming you had wood to feed it and a small child willing to fetch it. Ah, firewood. The early settlers didn't bother with yoga or CrossFit. No, their winter wellness regime consisted of hours trudging through snowdrifts up to their chins, wielding an axe with the finesse of very determined, very frozen lumber elves. Chopping wood was not just a task, it was a battle cry. And forget smart thermostats. Home temperature regulation meant someone, usually the youngest and/or lightest sleeper, was charged with the midnight log run. Nothing says sweet dreams like a 3 a.m. journey through icy winds just to keep Aunt Hildy's toes from going blue. But once the stove was humming and the fire dancing merrily, the entire household would gather close like moths who'd read a good review. Think of it as the Wi-Fi router of its day, the source of all connection. Here, cereals were scorched into existence, boots were steamed dry into delightful new shapes, and toes were toasted to golden perfection. Living quarters in a frontier cabin were approximately the size of your average modern walk-in closet, but the people were inventive. Beds were stacked tighter than a stagecoach during Gold Rush week. Siblings, cousins, and possibly a stray chicken or two, all sandwiched together under a mound of quilts heavy enough to pin a grown ox. Flannel, night clothes were not just about warmth. Many folks couldn't afford nightwear designated for sleeping, so they simply kept wearing what they wore for chores, and then hoped the stink would freeze solid before becoming noticeable. Speaking of freezing, let's talk about windows. Actually, let's talk about the charming lack of insulation. Glass panes weren't always affordable, so some families used greased paper instead. That's right. Paper soaked in animal fat became a translucent miracle, letting in a gentle, blurry light reminiscent of smeared butter on a camera lens. It filtered the frost-glittered world outside into something fabulously unhelpful for seeing anything clearly, but useful for keeping out at least some of the snowflakes, and all but the most ambitious raccoons. And bathing. Oh, listeners, darling listeners. Bathing in the pioneer winter was a decision one made only with considerable reflection and the promise of strong moral reward. A weekly bath might consist of heating precious water over the stove and pouring it into a tin tub that rocked slightly every time you moved. The water cooled approximately 7 seconds after you stepped in. Families often shared the same bath water, oldest to youngest, which is to say, by the end, it was less bath and more a warmish stew of mystery. Yet, despite the cold and the constant threat of turning into historical popsicles, there was a peculiar sort of coziness. Families read aloud by firelight, perhaps from a single treasured book that had made its way west in a travel trunk, alongside a discolored photograph and exactly one teacup. Children played games involving buttons, string, and a level of imagination bordering on wizardry. And perhaps most touchingly, folks told stories, real ones, embellished ones, hilariously exaggerated ones where barn cats fought off wolves and Grandpappy outwitted a bear using only a stale biscuit and sheer sass. Outside, the wind howled like it was auditioning for a role in a ghost story. Snow piled up on rooftops and slid off in great hunks that thudded against the ground like snowy loaves of bread. But inside, there was warmth, tattered but determined blankets, steaming cups of sassafras tea, and a kind of togetherness that made the long nights a bit more bearable. And so, as the fire crackled and the night stretched out like a quiet canvas over the prairie, the pioneers settled in, not for dreams of comfort, but dreams of surviving just one more moon of ice, one more test of grit, one more chance to wake up with all their toes. Of course, none of it would have worked without another essential winter survival strategy. One that involved layers of surprising ingenuity, leftover flour sacks, and the greatest unsung hero of the frontier wardrobe. But that's a tale best unraveled under even warmer blankets. Snowflakes fell like soft punctuation marks on a sentence the wind refused to finish. Across the western plains and tucked into the not-so-gentle valleys of the Rockies, pioneer settlers were preparing for what locals called winter and what everyone else might reasonably classify under polite expletives. The cold wasn't just a temperature, it was a presence. It crept under doorframes like an unwanted guest, sipped your coffee before you could, and whispered in frozen tones, "You really didn't bring enough firewood, did you?" Woodcutting, by the way, was less a chore and more a full-time winter flirtation with madness. Your average pioneer would spend hours splitting logs in biting winds, cursing every knot in the wood with language so colourful it accidentally invented 3 new dialects. Axes grew dull quickly, arms grew sore even quicker, and sled dogs judged freely. They knew, after all, that humans were the only creatures foolish enough to live somewhere that froze your breath mid-sentence. Speaking of homes, the term cozy cabin is historically flexible. Many pioneer dwellings had gaps between logs wide enough to facilitate dialogues with raccoons. Walls were insulated with mud, moss, and on particularly desperate days, equal parts optimism and cow hair. Some families lined the insides with newspaper, turning a casual glance at the wall into a surprise reading of 1849's finest gossip, like how Mrs. Turner's bread rose 3 inches last Sunday and whether the mayor's mustache had mysteriously moved to the left during town meetings. Inside these rustic masterpieces of consequence over comfort, you'd often find 1 or 2 cast-iron stoves wheezing out heat, like a Victorian librarian disapproving of your tone. These stoves didn't just heat the room. They cooked, boiled, dried socks, and served as makeshift footrests, dance partners, and sometimes, if loneliness stretched too long, conversationalists. "You're the only one who really gets me," a weary farmer may sigh, leaning on the stove. Clank. Stove for, I know. Food during the deep months followed 3 basic tenets: boiled, dried, and unidentifiable. Salt pork made regular appearances, not because anyone liked it, but because it couldn't be destroyed, even by a nuclear winter or picky children. Bread was sometimes made from flour ground from corn, wheat, or hope, depending on what was in the bin. And beans. Beans were the culinary equivalent of a handshake, simple, reliable, and occasionally dramatic. Candles and lamps were the only available lighting, soft, flickering beacons that made even the hardest edges of life seem hazily romantic. Shadows danced across timbered ceilings, accompanied by the occasional bug, performing its slow, ponderous descent into the wax. Children played quiet games by the hearth, like guess when the roof will leak, or count the socks that match. Evenings passed with slow ritual. A pipe might be lit, its tendrils curling upward, weaving tiny smoky stories into the rafters. Someone, usually the person with the least musical ability, but the most confidence, might begin plucking a fiddle. And heaven help the settlers who had to sit through Uncle Jedediah's rendition of Turkey in the Straw again. Despite everything, or perhaps because of everything, laughter came easy in those clapboard fortresses with their frost-covered windows. Humor, you see, was the insulation of the soul. When the wind howled like a tired preacher and the roof threatened to become a basement, the only sensible reaction was to find something to chuckle about, like how Ma always flirted with disaster by overfilling the stew pot, or how Pa insisted he could predict storm patterns based on the color of the chickens. And outside, beneath the vast and indifferent stars, coyotes yipped opinions the settlers didn't ask for, and the trees whispered secrets to the land beneath their frozen roots. Dreams came wrapped in thick quilts, stuffed with the feathers of birds that definitely had opinions about their contribution to the cause. The world slowed, the stove dimmed, and sleep tiptoed in on icicle toes. Somewhere in the dark, a kettle began to sing to itself, signaling a new day was waiting beneath the snow. With sunrise still hours away, we might draw the quilt a little tighter and drift deeper into the hush, where the next chapter waits to thaw. By the time the first frost settled gently on the mossy edges of the rough-hewn fence posts, the settlers, those brave cold-footed champions of the frontier, had already come to a silent understanding. Winter would not be reasoned with. It arrived like a guest you didn't invite, wearing 9 layers of ice and carrying a bag full of inconveniences. It knocked once, and then made itself entirely at home. Life in a frontier cabin during the winter months has often been romanticized. Cozy fires, gingham quilts, steaming bowls of rabbit stew. But those details conveniently skip over the small matter of how you had to wring the stew out of partially thawed snowshoe, hair, which frankly, didn't always want to become stew in the first place. Sometimes the fire gave out, sometimes the floor creaked in ominous ways, and sometimes you awoke only to find your socks frozen to the wall. Still, there was a rhythm to it all, as if the snow had a soft metronome ticking in time with the crackling of the wood stove. Frontier folk became experts in the age-old pastime of not going outside unless absolutely necessary. And that bar was quite high. Absolutely necessary typically involved a bear, a childbirth, or, for the particularly brave, a missing mitten. When temperatures dipped below what the whiskey could thaw, indoor life grew inventive. A pioneer child in the winter had two choices: read the family Bible again, or carve a toy out of whatever hadn't already been turned into kindling or snowshoe parts. Many settled for whittling small animals. Sure, they never looked exactly like animals, but they had ears, sometimes two, and that seemed close enough. Anything more accurate was considered extravagant. Evening hours were quietly spent in a kind of communal hibernation. Gathered low around the hearth like cats that used to be human, families played games with names like Button, Button, Who's Got the Button? Which, in most cases, also doubled as a real-time accounting procedure for their total number of buttons. Buttons were currency, personality, and protection from frostbite, and no one wanted to lose a shirt because little Thomas thought, "Button, button," sounded more fun than "May I please respectfully guard my button." Blankets were stacking much the same way economic theories do, heavily and without end. Quilts weren't just cozy. They were multi-generational patchwork family trees, stitched by grandmothers who knew just how to hide a good secret between layers of calico. Beneath these deep layers, people snuggled so thoroughly that they often required negotiation and pulley systems just to get back out in the morning. Now, despite what modern movies might suggest, saloons were not warm retreats from the cold. In fact, most didn't even have doors that fully shut, or windows that kept out the drafty whispers of the frost. A trip to the saloon in the dead of winter was like challenging the elements to a duel and losing 3 fingers in the process. Which, to be fair, some did. And yet, settlers remained resolute, fueled by something stronger than wood-fired heat. Pride, maybe. Or stubbornness. Or simply the knowledge that spring would arrive eventually, dragging mud in its wake, but at least unfreezing the outhouse. For food, winter brought a kind of creative jazz to the appetite. Menus were flexible, and not in a good way. Soup described any hot liquid that didn't kill you. Preserved apples, once crisp and tart, had the same texture as a page from the family Bible. Even molasses had its dark days, both literally and spiritually. Still, people would step outside, chip off a piece of the frozen fence, and say, "Could be worse, could be Boston." And perhaps they were right. In their cramped cabins, curled like commas under impossibly heavy quilts, these frontier households formed hibernation societies. They spent the nights trading ghost stories, gossip, and dreams half remembered from warmer nights. All while the wind howled outside, sounding a bit like it too, regretted not bringing mittens. As the fire dipped to embers and the frost climbed leisurely up the inside of the window panes, it was time to close their eyes and drift into dreams of meadows and sunlight, corn nearly waist high, and butter that didn't require a hatchet. And with the snow still falling softly in slow spirals outside the chinking of their log homes, one couldn't help but wonder how, in the hush of midwinter, these pioneers found clever ways to laugh, perhaps even dance, without ever really leaving the house. Just ahead lies a tale of one such winter pastime, where silence didn't mean boredom, and snow proved the perfect backdrop for something rather unexpected. By midwinter, everything out west tended to look like a half-finished sketch. Pencil lines of frost tracing fence posts, a few jots of wood smoke curling from cabin chimneys, and an enormous, colourless sky that hung above it all like a forgotten ceiling. For the settlers brave, or let's be honest, sometimes just bewildered, enough to squat down and call this icy frontier home, the months between December and March were less a season and more a character test proctored by Mother Nature herself, who was never known for her mercy or her sense of humour. Cabins, hastily assembled from whatever logs hadn't been chewed through by beavers or used as firewood in a moment of desperation, were never what you'd call well insulated. Walls were as porous as a gossipy grandmother, and floors often just packed earth with a sprinkling of ambition. If you were lucky, a buffalo hide lay across the threshold. If not, you had the wind for company, and the wind liked to gossip too, mostly about how cold your toes looked. One early homesteader in the Dakota Territory, Abigail Prescott, kept a diary in which she famously wrote, "Our windows rattle like skeletons arguing. I slept last night in full clothes, bonnet and mittens. George attempted to remove his boots but changed his mind due to emotional cold." George, presumably her husband, was a practical man. He'd started cooking beans on the stove while still wearing his wool socks on his hands, as one did. Amid the freezing, creaking quiet, the days took on a rhythm ruled by the stove, which was treated like royalty. It had the best seat in the house. Everyone angled themselves toward it like pilgrims at a shrine. The stove received offerings of wood or cow chips. Yes, those. While the family sat around it telling stories, mending clothes, or trading hopeful rumors that spring might appear before June this year, if God's in a decent mood. It wasn't all hardship though. There was a certain joy to the simplicity. Nights spent together playing fiddle tunes, badly, or reading from the one book the family owned, usually a Bible, occasionally a Sears and Roebuck catalogue that had doubled as kindling, inspiration, and, later in the season, emergency wallpaper. The catalogue was especially beloved for debates over which iron cooking stove looked the sturdiest and which boots might survive mud, frost, and marital disappointment. Odd inventions began popping up during these duller months too. One gentleman in Wyoming devised a bed-warming apparatus by stuffing hot coals into an iron kettle, then sealing it in a saucepan, then sealing that in his coat, and then, quite nearly, setting his trousers and himself on fire. The frontier wasn't short on ingenuity. It was just short on insulation and fireproofing standards. And yet, despite the bleak weather, or maybe because of it, neighbors became surprisingly essential. A knock at the cabin door could mean disaster or delight. Sick calf, lost child, or possibly the arrival of Ida Littlejohn from 2 valleys over, juggling a jar of pickled turnips and some questionable molasses cakes. Hospitality was never optional. You shared warmth, space, and stories. And in those stories, the beast grew ever larger, the snow ever deeper, and the soup ever thinner. Hyperbole heated the soul when the stove couldn't. And oh, the pets. A well-fed cat was considered better foot insulation than a second pair of socks, and dogs were treated less like animals and more like alarm systems and portable, furry radiators. Some families even tried to keep a chicken or 2 inside to protect the precious egg supply from frostbite, with mixed hygiene results. Breakfast became a bit of an adventure, a game of find that egg before it freezes solid. Still, as snow curled around fence rails and hoarfrost coated each twig, In delicate white lace, there was something strangely beautiful about winter's silence. It softened the world and reminded everyone that progress could wait, errands could wait, even laundry could wait, which frankly, it had already been waiting since October. So curled under quilts stuffed with horsehair or feathers, or in emergency cases, a combination of both, pioneers settled into their seasonal stillness. And as the wind told secrets across the frozen prairie, even the most anxious hearts found peace in the slow, snowy lullaby of winter. Soon, the thaw would come. But first, there were still tales to share, beans to burn, and molasses cakes that no one wanted to admit were terrible. Somewhere beyond the white landscape, a spring-loaded miracle was stirring, quietly. On nights when the prairie wind curled beneath the door like a particularly nosy ghost, pioneers did what all sensible people did. They pretended the winter wasn't trying to murder them. Instead, they gathered round crackling wood stoves, layered in scratchy wool, and told stories to distract from the fact that their toes had lost all sensation somewhere around breakfast. It was a truth universally acknowledged on the frontier. You couldn't control the cold, but you could certainly outbore it. And so began the golden era of wintertime errands that could have waited until spring. Anything to avoid cabin fever, which, like actual fever, was mostly terrifying and mildly contagious. Now, consider the pioneer grocery list in February. Flour? Sure. Salt pork? Absolutely. A newspaper from last October that's finally reached the trading post. Jackpot. So bundled like a sentient quilt, the designated errand runner would set out, bearing all the cheerful confidence of someone who hadn't yet lost a mitten in a snowdrift. One might wonder, how far was the trading post? Well, that depended on two things: how recently it snowed, and whether your nearest neighbor lived within or beyond shouting distance, which in pioneer terms could mean anything under 15 miles. There were no plowed roads, only best guesses and frozen ruts where wagons had once bounced along in warmer months. Navigation was equal parts instinct, stubbornness, and a kind of blind optimism born of being very cold, very often. And yet, pioneers developed remarkable tricks for surviving these Arctic crusades. One clever soul in Nebraska swore by stuffing hot potatoes in his coat pockets, lunch and hand warmers in one earthy bundle. Others layered their clothing with such fervor that removing it in spring resembled an archaeological dig, peeling back the flannel ages to discover forgotten biscuit crumbs and at least one borrowed sock. Snowshoes were more than just comically large footwear. They were passports to motion. Of course, the first time anyone tried them, they almost certainly fell flat on their face, like a newborn moose trying ballet. But necessity breeds grace, and soon these giant pine ovals became an essential part of any local fashion ensemble, particularly flattering when paired with 3 scarves and an expression of quiet desperation. Inside the homestead, life was a cautious art form. Pipes froze, doors warped, and chickens, if they hadn't already invited themselves into the kitchen, dreamed of Florida from the safety of the barn. Water had to be hauled in daily and kept close to the stove, unless you fancied breaking your teeth on morning tea. And forget about bathing. Hot baths were a team sport involving boiled water, a tin tub, and the collective resignation that hygiene was optional until April. Children, wild with energy that nature cruelly refused to recognize, made their own entertainment. Snow tunnels became elaborate hideouts, fortresses of solitude interrupted only by the occasional collapse and brief moment of panic. Indoors, they invented games like Don't Wake Pa and who took the last candle stub. Thrilling. Pastimes generally concluded by someone scolding everyone and going back to darning socks. But perhaps the true marvel of winter life was the constant, low-level baking. Bread, biscuits, pies, anything that produced warmth and a smell that told the brain, "You're not dead yet." There was always something simmering, even if it was just a hopeful batch of lard fried potatoes that tasted suspiciously like iron. Baking wasn't merely a chore. It was both survival strategy and aromatic therapy. One good pie could do what 3 sermons and a muffled hymn might not. Keep a person believing in spring. Some homesteaders kept diaries, filling them with laconic poetry such as "Snowed again," "Firewood low," "Save the good soap for guests." These entries, often written in cramped script illuminated by whale oil lamps or tallow candles, survive today as dreamy time capsules, snapshots of a people who endured winter not in spite of the cold, but alongside it, like awkward roommates forced together by fate and geography. And each time the wind howled like a coyote with opinions, wise pioneers merely pulled their quilts tighter, adjusted the kettle on the stove, and murmured something hopeful about March, or April, or the great and distant fantasy called June. Eventually, even the fiercest blizzards would hush to silence, and in the glow of lamplight, with the floorboards creaking softly under shifting logs, many would fall asleep mid-page, the dulcet snores of those who'd outlasted the storm again. As the snow drifted deeper and the woodpile dwindled to a suspiciously low pyramid, the time came to unravel one of the community's more curious customs, the winter mailman's ceremonial arrival. By the time the frost had settled in for good and the rivers wore their ice coats again, the pioneers had developed a sixth sense for weather. Not meteorology, mind you, more like weathery wisdom. A quirky cocktail of throbbing joints, frozen, whiskers, and the way the smoke from a chimney curled. If it shot straight up, the air was still. If it slapped sideways like an offended hand, a storm was coming. If it didn't appear at all, someone had probably forgotten to chop that day's firewood. And chopping wood was no small feat. The average settler's log pile could have passed for a primitive sculpture garden, stacked with obsessive precision, each round lined up like sleepy sentinels, guarding against the chill. Children learned early that wood warms you twice, once when you chop it, and again when you burn it. Technically, it warmed you a third time if you accidentally tripped over it in the dark, but that sort of warmth tended to be more emotional and less printable. Let's drift for a moment into one of these homes, the kind with gaps in the logs just roomy enough for a draft's daily commute, patched with mud and straw in the best case scenario, or random fabrics in the worst. The more poetic children like to say you could feel the wind whispering lullabies through the walls. The less poetic ones simply muttered and pulled the quilts tighter. Quilts, by the way, did a lot more than just sit sweetly on beds. They were currency, legacy, insulation, emotional support projects, and the 19th century version of a social media post. Except instead of likes, people stacked compliments like, "My stars, what tidy little stitches," or the much envied, "That's the warmest looking pattern I've ever seen." Even the mishmash quilts, stitched out of trouser legs and curtain regrets, held value. They were layered until beds felt like sleeping under a fabric lasagna. Warm, a bit heavy, and slightly chaotic if you moved too suddenly. Meanwhile, outside, the snow had a way of washing everything quiet. The vast plains and open lands wore silence like a winter shawl. Animals tiptoed under it. Footsteps disappeared into it. And the stars, Oh, the stars twinkled with smug brilliance as if they knew just how hard it was for humans to light anything more luminous than a sooty oil lamp. Pioneers had a nightly routine that began with exaggerating how cold it was, followed by the ceremonial fiddling with some sort of latch, lever, or damper to maximize stove heat efficiency. This usually did very little, but it gave the illusion of control. And when you're surviving a winter 2 days ride from the nearest town, illusions can be every bit as important as reality. Speaking of the town, a trip into one during a snowstorm was the 1800s version of extreme sports. Snowdrifts often reached the waist. Roads turned into white mysteries, leaving even seasoned travelers whispering, "I think this is where Jenkins' barn used to be." Just about everyone had a story of someone who ended up 3 miles off course and accidentally stumbled into the neighbor's smokehouse instead of their own root cellar. Mail delivery slowed to a crawl, making news travel with all the speed and accuracy of a drowsy tortoise. It was not uncommon for someone to excitedly tear into a letter mid-February, only to realize it was inviting them to a New Year's party of the previous year. And yet, through all of it, there was warmth, even in the cold. Families circling together by a stove, telling stories so often they practically became folklore in progress. Friends patching ripped mittens with old yarn and silent heroism. A pot of beans bubbling with stubborn optimism on the fire. Not to mention the underground sport of foot-warming diplomacy, where cold toes crept beneath quilts in search of their unsuspecting partner's calves. This was usually met with a yelp, then forgiveness, then foot-wrestling diplomacy in the dark. Despite the long-nosed icicles hanging from the eaves and the wind's occasional tantrums against the walls, the pioneers endured. Not just endured, persisted. And somehow, curled beneath their stacked patchwork and dreams of thaw, they were already imagining something spring-like. But before the thaw would arrive, there was one more challenge to face. The mystery of winter food. Specifically, how to make root vegetables seem appetizing for the 3rd month in a row without a single merchant wagon in sight. But that's a dream for another night. The art of staying warm in the Old West was, in a word, creative. But if you've been imagining roaring fireplaces in every cabin and cozy buffalo robes snuggled over feather beds, well, it's time for a reality check. A very cold, drafty, and mildly ridiculous reality check. You see, pioneers didn't just battle the biting winds and blizzards. They negotiated with them, bargained with kindling, and at times, downright bribed the cold with copious layers of undergarments. And if you think long johns were merely an underlayer, think again. In the winter, they were practically a social contract. Taking them off before spring arrived was considered both scandalous and suicidal. Now, most cabins in the frontier weren't insulated. That's a polite way of saying that the wind blew straight through the wooden cracks, under the doors, and occasionally whispered bedtime insults through the chinks in the walls. Pioneer families learned to live with a certain level of indoor weather. Snow inside the home wasn't technically expected, but it wasn't entirely unexpected either. Heating, as it were, came down to 2 primary tools: the iron stove and an irrational optimism. The stove was the workhorse of the household. It heated the room, cooked the food, dried the socks, sometimes cooked the socks, and added a touch of excitement by occasionally belching smoke or setting nearby curtains alight. These stoves were often second-hand, dented, and acquired through the classic frontier ritual of bartering for something slightly broken, but still good enough to survive a Montana winter. Pioneer stoves were so valued that they were named, doted on, and occasionally fought over. In fact, more than one cold season squabble began with, Doris, I swear if you move my boots from beside old Smoky again. But for those frigid souls who ventured beyond the warm circle of the stove, say, out to the outhouse at night, the cold became more than uncomfortable. It became a philosophical experience, a chance to reflect on one's regrets while gripping a lantern and skipping over frozen slush in nothing but a thin shawl and trembling resolve. Ah yes, the outhouse. A most inconvenient convenience. You'd wrap yourself in every blanket not nailed down, trudge through potentially waist-deep snow, confront the local raccoon population, and do your business in a wooden box that had all the charm of a pine coffin and twice the draft. Some pioneers used their outhouse trips as an opportunity to meditate. Many emerged from them spiritually awakened, or frostbitten. Inside the cabin, though, people had their own tricks for enduring the cold. Beds were rarely solo affairs. Entire families piled in together, creating what one might politely call a snoring heap of survival. Spoons were not just utensils, they were positions. The bigger the heap, the warmer the slumber. If you found yourself on the edge of the bed pile, you were in what they called the frost zone. It was a position of honor for the toughest family members, or, more often, the smallest children, who could be flung back into the center if they started shivering too dramatically. Then there were the warmers. Not electric ones, of course. We're talking about heated bricks, wrapped in cloth, snuck into beds like toasty contraband, or baked potatoes, yes, really, that served double duty as foot warmers before becoming part of breakfast. Nothing says frontier efficiency like sleeping with tomorrow's side dish. Blankets were tea-stained, lard-greased, occasionally moth-chewed treasures. Quilts made from worn-out clothing were common, stitched together from faded trousers and work shirts, often with bits of stories tangled in the threads. Uncle Elijah's vest here, Ma's apron square there. Wrapped in heirlooms and kitchen memories, people didn't just sleep warm. They slept in the folds of their own family history. Even with all this ingenuity, freezing nights took their toll. Beards froze solid. Chapped lips became a shared phenomenon. One pioneer lady wrote in her journal, "We kissed goodnight like two frozen apples bumping together." And yet, somehow, they endured, grumbling, joking, layering sock upon sock, and clinging stubbornly to the warmth of each other. And as the wind howled across the black prairie outside, the little iron stove glowed in the darkness, puffing like a sleepy dragon. Boots steamed on the hearth, a potato warmed someone's toes, and somewhere in the moonlit hush, a dog sneezed and rolled closer to the quilted pile of snoring humans. Now, let's ease deeper into the frosty wilderness, where warmth took on strange, furry forms, and the idea of keeping a cow in the kitchen wasn't quite as silly as it sounds. On the long, pale horizon of a Dakota winter, the sun barely bothered to rise before packing its bags and setting again. Somewhere between those feeble hours of light, pioneers managed to get chores done. Not always well, not always willingly, but with a kind of rustic resolve that would make modern convenience weep under an electric blanket. Now, when you think of the Wild West, you might picture stampeding horses, saloon doors swinging with drama, and wide-brimmed hats shading squinty eyes. But in winter, every cowboy and clapboard house was at the mercy of frost and boredom. The cattle drives faded into slippery stables, and the saloon's piano froze in a key of ice. In short, it got deeply, profoundly tedious, which brings us to the noble pioneer pastime of making candles. Yes, dear listener, when winter howled through the cracks in log cabins and the wind howled like a harmonica with pneumonia, the settlers lit their beetle-fat, tallow-dipped candles to chase back the shadows, and maybe the crushing winter ennui. Tallow, for the blessedly uninitiated, is rendered animal fat. Suet from cows, sheep, occasionally bears, if one stumbled unaware into a well-placed trap. And while it doesn't sound like a romantic substance, it was practically colonial gold when shaped and strung into candles. The process was simple but slow, like learning to waltz on crutches. First, you'd melt the tallow, then dip a wick into it, again, and again, and again. That nib of string went in thin, came out thicker, slowly morphing into a waxy cocoon of flickering light. The smell? Well, imagine the scent of wet mittens, cooked bacon grease, and heroic optimism. And that might be generous. Still, nights were long, and it gave people something vaguely productive to do as the wind rearranged their roof shingles. Children were occasionally involved too, but don't worry, it wasn't entirely Dickensian. They got to scrape wax, count finished candles, and, on especially thrilling evenings, measure candle lengths for even burning times. It was like the Olympics, if the events were tallow drip control and longest flicker under duress. In these moments, candles turned into more than mere tools. They were guardians of warmth, tiny resistances to the dark, a single, wobbling flame standing upright in defiance of winter's cold shoulder. Of course, some folks got clever. In towns fortunate enough to have a general store, beeswax was the upscale alternative. Cleaner burning, vaguely less smelly, and often used in the bedrooms of folks who owned more spoons than children. A rarity. These candles were luxuries, tucked away for courting nights, Christmas dinners, or that 1 month when Aunt Maribel came to visit, insisted on cleanliness, and promised not to offend anyone this time. Narrators, note, she absolutely would. And even as candles sputtered in sooty holders, old tin lanterns or hand-carved sconces, families huddled around fires and wove glowing silhouettes into the wood-panelled walls. Shadows danced across sleeping babies and tin cups. Stories were told, tales of river crossings, of buffalo sightings remembered too boldly, of neighbours who surely built their privy far too close to the well and would regret it come spring. Sometimes those shadows were joined by the rhythmic scrape of needle on fabric. Quilting bees didn't actually require bees, just chilly fingers, gossip about Mrs. Danner's new wool friend, and enough scraps to warm a bed frame. Patterns emerged not by design, but necessity. A patch from Pa's old coat met a square from a flour sack, both stitched under the light of a dripping candle, their seams whispering stories future generations would imagine as legend. Even the cats, curled in gusty corners, flicked their tails toward the dancing lights, probably wondering why humans went to such trouble to avoid sleeping properly through the winter. And sleep they eventually did, wrapped in wool, warmed by the low flicker of a homemade candle, hopeful that by morning the snow might pause, or the roof stop creaking, or the eggs not freeze solid in the henhouse. In the hush of darkness, the flame bent low. Quiet returned. And so did the promise of another day. Another morning for bread dough that wouldn't rise, for boots stiff as floorboards, and for the next great adventure in wintertime survival, checking if the well had frozen again. But before that, somewhere in that dimming quiet, someone, perhaps your great-great-grandsomeone, was stirring from their worn quilt, blinking blearily at the frost-laced windows, pondering a far more luxurious invention than candles, the chamber pot, and that peculiar little porcelain revolution. Well, that's a comfort tale best saved for later. Somewhere between the howling of the wind and the creaking of frozen floorboards, the pioneers discovered the true value of thick socks, and worse, the tragedy of underestimating flannel. The winter months were not merely inconvenient. They were an annual audition for survival, performed in woolen underwear and desperation. Pioneer winters in the American West were unforgiving, but never lacking in character, especially when it came to heating methods. Most log cabins were heated by a single fireplace, which, despite its romantic reputation, was about as effective as trying to heat Lake Michigan with a candle. If you stood directly in front of it, you might roast your kneecaps to a crisp. Take 2 steps back, though, and you were suddenly trapped in a freezer wearing your great-grandmother's bonnet. Insulation? Oh, bless your optimism. Cabins were built with gaps between the logs big enough to make a raccoon feel welcome. Pioneers had to stuff the cracks with anything they could find: mud, moss, old newspapers, the ponderings of hope itself. And let's not forget chinking, possibly the only time mud and desperation became a building material. Some families even used their children to plug particularly blustery gaps. Allegedly, little Billy once stood guard in the east wall for most of January, a loyal draft blocker rewarded only with a biscuit and a lukewarm hug. The days were short, the nights eternal, and entire families huddled together in a nocturnal human lasagna, layered in buffalo hides and hand-me-down quilts. There was no privacy, of course, just a unified agreement not to discuss Aunt Martha's snoring or Uncle Horace's midnight singing, which he called praying, but everyone else called concerning. Yet somehow comfort was found. Some pioneers crafted bed warmers, flat metal pans filled with embers, tucked beneath the covers before bedtime. Absolutely ingenious, unless of course you forgot to empty it before climbing in. Thus was born the phrase heated argument, likely following several charred night shift surprise attacks. And food, oh, well, that was a gamble in itself. Root cellars became treasure chests of wrinkled potatoes and judgmental onions. Anything perishable had to be either salted, smoked, or so dry it could outlast a church sermon. Jerky became the nearest thing to protein. Chewing one piece often took longer than actually catching the deer in the first place. Tea was brewed from bark and berries, occasionally with a rogue pine needle for flair. Hot drinks were savoured slowly, both for warmth and for the brief illusion that you were fancy somewhere in New England reading by firelight, and not, in reality, drinking sassafras with your mittens on, dreaming of rooms with doors that closed. Mail delivery didn't happen often in the heart of winter, but when it did, it was greeted like a religious event. A letter from back east, even if it was just Cousin Clara complaining about laundry starch, became worthy of being read aloud 5 times, then discussed as if it were scripture. Gossip, you see, kept the soul warm. The livestock had their own frostbitten dramas. Animals were herded as close to the residents as socially acceptable, which bore strange consequences. Chickens sometimes roosted in the rafters. Cows sulked near the porch. And once, allegedly, a pig named Clarence refused to leave once he discovered the joys of the kitchen. He became something of a pet/roommate, until he grew a bit too fond of sleeping inside flour sacks and accidentally hogging the hearth. But perhaps the greatest miracle of all was community. Neighbors looked out for one another, often sending teenage sons to deliver firewood or check on widows. Barn dances would spring up in defiance of the gloom. Someone always had a fiddle. Someone always tried to call square dances despite never really grasping the concept of rhythm. And someone always brought molasses cookies that could not, by any modern metric, be called edible. but they smiled when they handed them over, so you smiled back as you chewed through. In a world where every morning began with a scrape of frost from the water bucket and ended swaddled in layers that weighed more than your conscience, ingenuity and laughter were tools as essential as any shovel or shotgun. And even as the night pressed in and the snow whispered against shuttered glass, the pioneers lay in their beds, full of turnips and tails, warmed by hope, and perhaps the faint foolhardy belief that spring was just a few snowstorms away. Let's drift a little further now, onward through the stillness, where another flicker of warmth is waiting, as the sun trundled behind the towering peaks of the Rockies, throwing long shadows across the snow-drifted plains. Something curious happened along forgotten trails, and within shuttered frontier cabins, winter madness began to quietly blossom, like a snowflake caught on the tip of a broken icicle. And no, not the dramatic kind with shouting and axe-wielding. Oh no, this was the milder, more neighborly species of madness, the sort cured with storytelling, stew, and the occasional sled race involving chickens. You see, by January, many pioneers had long since run out of any respectable form of entertainment. The beans were cooked, the fiddle was more or less in tune, and they'd read the label on every tin can in the pantry, twice. So they devised a peculiar system of resisting cabin fever. They called it getting creative. Now, creative in the frost-nipped West didn't always mean stitching a patchwork quilt of 93 patterns or composing a heartfelt ballad about your lost oxen, though both were attempted with varying degrees of success. Sometimes it simply meant organizing a spelling bee with your cows as the judges, though Bessie was notoriously partial to words beginning with moo. Inside the average pioneer cabin, typically built from logs, dreams, and questionable insulation, you might find a family huddled around the hearth, wrapped in coats, quilts, and, very often, mild delusion. The mortar between the logs might let in so much wind that their hair swayed indoors. Yet still, they persevered, often by telling tales taller than the nearest snowdrift. Take the Morrison family of Dakota Territory, for instance. One January evening, with snow elbow-deep and boredom deeper, Grandfather Morrison declared he'd once lassoed a hawk out of mid-air, using nothing but thread unwound from Aunt Millie's crocheted tea cozy. Millie, after a long pause, offered only this: "Well, that would explain the hole in my cozy." Or consider young Elmer Hart, who managed to invent the region's first indoor sled. It went exactly 4 feet across the floorboards before colliding with the pantry and unleashing a small avalanche of dried peas. Local law says those peas were still being found in the cracks of the cabin floor come June. Of course, community gatherings helped, when weather permitted, and permitted was defined very loosely, often just meaning one could trudge to a neighbor's without losing a limb. Pioneers would band together in what would today be considered highly dangerous potlucks. Picture a snow-packed barn lit by lanterns, warmed slightly by guests packed more densely than the bread pudding. Each guest brought dishes cooked under impossible circumstances. Biscuits baked over a fire where half the wood had been damp and the other half had emotional baggage. Stews that included gamey meats and even gamier guesses. But no matter, folks came hungry, both for food and for human contact. And oh, the entertainment. There might be a banjo solo by someone missing 2 strings and having only a general sense of rhythm, or dramatized readings from the only book in town, the Sears, Roebuck & Co. catalogue, which, in the right hands and with a dramatic flair, could bring an entire room to tears during the boot section. They laughed, they groaned, They occasionally had to dig someone's sleigh out of a snowbank the next morning. But every chuckle was a torch against winter's long darkness. Back inside their homes, the quieter hours resumed. Children wrote letters they'd never send, describing dreams they didn't yet have words for. Parents mended clothes by candlelight, threading hope into every stitch. Evenings grew longer but softer, filled with murmurings about the coming thaw. For all its howling intensity, winter had a way of sharpening the focus on the small, brave ordinary. A warm potato, a flickering flame, the sound of a loved one snoring under 3 layers of patchwork pride. And though they often woke up to find frost flowers etched on the inside of the window pane, delicate, ghostly, no one was ever truly alone. Even the wind seemed to agree, easing into something gentler as it whisked across the endless white. And just as the fire dropped to its final embers, and someone muttered a sleepy night, the hush of the season deepened. There, waiting beneath the silence, lay one of winter's oldest secrets. It was never only about surviving. It was about remembering how strange, stubborn, and splendid it was to keep going. As the snow fell steady and slow outside, something else quietly began to stir. A preparation, just out of sight, for what came next, just around the turn of a rather peculiar February. There was a particular kind of cold that settled over the west, like a lazy cat on a warm lap. Unyielding, oddly comfortable once you'd accepted your fate, and entirely uninterested in your protests. Winter on the frontier did not ask for permission. Like a stern aunt from the old country, it knocked once, entered anyway, and stayed longer than anyone hoped. By mid-January, nearly every settler cabin across the snowy plains had become a museum of improvisation. Walls, hastily built from mismatched planks, were reinforced with buffalo, hides, muddy wattle, or, when desperation thoroughly overruled taste, old flour sacks soaked in bacon grease. There was something profoundly humbling about stuffing your home's wind-facing cracks with beaver pelts that just a month ago you were bragging about selling in St. Louis. Now they were insulation. Life, you might say, had its own priorities. Inside these frost-kissed homes, families clung to warmth with a kind of dignified panic. The hearth, when it held any fire at all, was less a charming centerpiece and more a survival engine. Each log was burned with reverence and judgment. Did this one last longer than the ash yesterday? Should we try burning dried cow patties again? The answer, incidentally, was no, absolutely not, unless one enjoys a living room that smells like a barn sneezing into a volcano. To pass the time and keep their minds from turning wholly to icicles, pioneers turned to frigid forms of indoor entertainment. This included fiercely competitive checker tournaments, the rereading of the same 3 Bible verses until they glowed in the dark, or my personal favorite, Guess That Draft, a family game wherein you tried to identify which corner the cold air was creeping in from this time. Children, being composed largely of imagination and empty stomachs, fared better. They built forts inside forts, scavenging chairs, quilts, and the family wash tub to build dream palaces within the 1-bedroom cabin. If you peeked beneath a mound of patchwork, you might catch a pair of mischievous eyes and hear a whispered tale of Fort Icepick or Snowball Mountain. That is, until the mother arrived brandishing a wet sock and a look that could curdle milk. Once outside, the frozen world was even stranger. The snow did not so much blanket the earth as it entombed it. Everything slowed, muffled, and slightly tilted. The roads, when visible at all, were sheets of white uncertainty littered with the occasional lost boot or wheel hub. It wasn't uncommon to find horses looking wistfully into the distance, fully reconsidering their career path. Yet not all was bleak. The harshness of the season brought with it a curious quiet, a silence that could only exist where humans were too cold to argue. Critters hibernated, creeks paused mid-babble, and the wind took long, whistling strolls across the prairie. Even the crows, normally so smug, seemed to mutter under their breath, "This is ridiculous," before flapping miserably back to their frozen perches. The bitter cold also made folks oddly generous. Nothing warms the heart quite like a neighbor trudging through waist-high snow to bring over some parsnip soup and half of a joke they'd remembered from before Christmas. It was something about a preacher, a mule, and a cold outhouse, they'd begin, then forget the punchline entirely. But it didn't matter. The laughter was real, and the soup was, at the very least, hot. Meals during this time were events, elaborate, elastic, sometimes alarming events. A stew might contain anything from squirrel to disappointment, thickened with flour, salt, and stern optimism. Biscuits doubled as paperweights and disciplinary tools. One resourceful woman famously made soup for an entire week from a stone, some bark, and sheer conviction. It tasted of pine and commitment. Somehow, through all of this, people didn't just survive, they bonded. Freezing together had a way of smoothing rough edges. Even the grumpiest trapper would share a flask by a fireside if it meant listening to a fiddler warm up his bowstrings. And when the snow reflected that pale orange sunset, and smoke curled from dozens of chimneys into the glassy sky, the west didn't feel so wild. It felt like home. And beneath the snowdrifts and sleeping fields, the land waited, silent, patient, gathering its voice again. Soon enough, something would stir beneath the frozen earth, lending a rhythm to the stillness. But for now, the wind whispered stories only the trees could understand. And somewhere, far from town, a lonely coyote howled in 3/4 time. As the long night lengthened and the fire settled to embers, another day of waiting began to thaw around the edges. And what came with that thaw, well, that would be an entirely different kind of adventure. The biting wind didn't care how many layers a pioneer wore. It had a talent for slipping through every stitch, knot, and deaf prayer of wool. And yet, somehow families made it work. Or at least they told themselves they did, while sitting around smoky stoves with cheeks red as overripe apples and socks as stiff as dried beef. Even in the dead of winter, frontier life didn't pause. Chores didn't freeze the way fingers did. Someone still had to go milk the cows, assuming the cows hadn't self-declared hibernation out of protest. Livestock, despite popular barnyard propaganda, were not fond of ice storms. Hens went on egg-laying strikes, oxen turned into statues overnight, and pigs, well, they snorted with such sheer contempt at the snowdrifts that farmers could only laugh and offer them a blanket or two. Inside the homes, there was a different kind of winter hustle. Candle making, sock darning, and something oddly named thrum mittens, woolen gloves filled with fuzzy ends of leftover yarn designed to make your hands look like a sheep through a tantrum, became the cozy industries of the season. These weren't mere crafts. They were acts of survival disguised as something almost meditative. And then there was quilting. Ah yes, the noble winter institution of quilt making. What served the dual purpose of keeping the cold out and keeping the gossip in. Quilt circles weren't just gatherings. They were the 1800s equivalent of social media. Local news passed stitch to stitch. Did you hear about old Amabel and the travelling salesman? Pass me the plum thread. And yes, she's expecting a delivery. Pioneers managed to wrap scandal and warmth into one thick patchwork square. Quilting bees were where hands warmed from labor, minds sparkled from conversation, and secrets were safely sewn into cotton. In those months when the sun barely showed up for work and the moon had to fill in, children found ways to entertain themselves that didn't require batteries or sanity in some cases. Frozen ponds became theaters for boot-sliding ballets. Snowbanks transformed into fortresses defended by icy snowballs and slightly worried parents. Indoors, games like Button Button Who's Got the Button were played with outrageous stakes, like the winner getting the last dried apple slice. High drama. At night, the fires crackled with a rhythm older than memory. Oil lamps cast soft glows across the wooden walls, shadows dancing like polite guests. Books, if you were lucky enough to own them, offered a few precious pages of escape. For those without, the oral tradition thrived. Stories passed from mouth to ear, some true, some wildly exaggerated. Your great-uncle wrestled a bear with a soup ladle, type tales, made better each winter by the frost of memory. Food, of course, dictated daily emotions. Winter menus were heavy on root vegetables, salted meat, and a puzzled thing called stew. Everything simmered. It had to. Boiling water made the house feel like it forgave you. And in this season of scarcity, nothing brought momentary joy quite like a pan of cornbread, or what passed for coffee, a fusion of ingenuity and desperation brewed from roasted chicory, dried acorns, or if things were really grim, old beans someone found behind the flour barrel. Still, it wasn't all grimness wrapped in flannel. Winter slowed things down, let people pause between survival quests. Letters from back east were read over and over like poetry. Someone would play the fiddle, even if frost made tightening the strings a feat of engineering. And when the music started, yes, even with numbs, fingers and squeaky tuning pegs, the room changed. Breath hung in the air between laughter and lyrics. Children leaned against their parents, and for a moment, the chill sat outside, politely waiting. Of course, no winter would be complete without discussing the chamber pot, a great equalizer in the world of frontier inconvenience. Braving a midnight journey to the outhouse was an extreme sport, which is why many opted for the humble porcelain bucket tucked under the bed. Half frozen and wholly embarrassing, it was nonetheless a small mercy in a world blanketed by ice. Sleep came slow, layered in every quilt the house owned, shared with siblings or cousins or both. Sometimes even a cat or a very dignified goat joined the mix. Dreams drifted through the rafters, mingling with the wind's lullaby, the creak of timbers, the ticking of a homemade clock, the occasional thunk of snow sliding from the roof. And below all of that, under the warm hush of slumber and the sour scent of drying mittens, the slow turning of seasons waited, as quietly and patiently as an old farmer eyeing the melting icicles. And as the frost softened and the stove's embers dimmed, a new sound stirred on the horizon. Bootsteps crunching in snow. Children's voices calling to one another. A signal that something, perhaps spring, perhaps trouble, was just around the bend. The wind howled fretfully through the rafters of the sod house, like a disgruntled ghost trying to file a complaint with the frontier's zoning board. Inside, beneath layers of patched-together quilts, itchy wool, and 2 canine foot warmers of dubious loyalty, the average pioneer family toughed out the winter one long, creaky night at a time. By now, the snowdrifts had stacked up outside like bad decisions, from the ground all the way to the window ledge, and the idea of stepping out for even a moment was less a practical activity and more a flirtation with hypothermia. Breaking trail in 3 feet of snow after breakfast just to check if the chickens were still clucking was, frankly, heroic. But heroism on the prairie often took odd forms, like surviving on little more than salt pork, mushy beans, and something called scrapple, which, according to no less than 6 first-hand pioneer diaries, defied both culinary decency and gravitational law. Yet against this grim backdrop of biting winds and salted despair rose another frontier tradition, the card game. Cards, you see, were more than entertainment. They were battlefield, therapy session, and household court of law all rolled into one. Tucked away from the biting cold, families would gather in rooms thick with pipe smoke and the scent of kerosene lamps, playing evenings away by the flicker of junior-sized flames. Children were taught to play not by gentle instruction, but by relentless losing. This was the pioneer way, education through relentless defeat, until you figured it out or cried, usually both. The games themselves were practical, old-maid, euchre, and something called whist, which to modern ears sounds less like a card game and more like a polite request. Now, outside the sod house, winter was staging its usual drama. Icicles dangled from the roof like nature's upside-down daggers, and a stubborn cold seeped in through every crack, nook, and nail hole. The frost on the inside of the windows became accidental artwork, delicate feathered patterns that looked like the dreams of mountaineers. Whispers of sound traveled better in winter, especially since the heavy snow dampened nearly everything else. You could hear your neighbor sneeze from a mile off. This led to the development of what historians refer to as long-range nosy neighbor culture, a pastime which needed no supplies beyond good ears and mild suspicion. As the family dozed near the hearth, some seated, some slumped, some flat out on the floor like exhausted cats, the flicker of firelight danced softly on the bark-lined walls. The logs crackled, reluctantly giving up their stored sunshine, and somewhere deep in the corner a kettle steamed like it too, wished it were born a potbelly stove instead. Not all entertainment was cards, of course. Storytelling remained a noble winter art. Pioneer yarns could stretch longer than February, and with only marginal respect for truth. Legends included everything from mysterious lights flickering on the horizon to tales of a cow that learned to ice skate, although that last one was suspiciously told only after the hard cider had made its 3rd family rotation. And there were, inevitably, musical interludes. Someone's uncle, there was always an uncle, would haul out a wheezy concertina or a vaguely tuned fiddle, scratch out a few notes, and launch into a rendition of something vaguely Irish, vaguely Appalachian, and definitely in need of rehearsal. But the music wasn't about precision. It was about conjuring summer in your mind while your toes went numb. It was about pretending, for the space of 3 wobbly refrains, that you were somewhere warm, somewhere easy, somewhere with 2 kinds of pie and no wolves within 20 miles. Outside, the wind shifted again. A low moan rattled the shutters. It didn't quite say anything, but it made its meaning clear. The night would be long, and your fire had better outlast it. Families would lean into each other, everyone clutching a last cup of warmth, be it tea, broth, or just barely warm molasses thin enough to pretend. The baby would gurgle, Grandpa would snore, Ma would knit with ferocity, and Pa would sigh like a man negotiating peace among merciless elements. And all the while, snow piled higher. Tomorrow, someone would have to unseal the door again, shovel a path to the outhouse, and check if the cabbage cellar had gone full iceberg. But tonight, wrapped snug in layers and stories, they stayed cocooned in flickering light and shared silence. Winter, stubborn as a mule and twice as loud, had parked itself over the territory, but the hearth still glowed, and just beyond the edge of sleep, the howl of the wind softened into a lullaby of sighs, setting the stage for the next curious chapter of prairie survival. Somewhere between the last chimney puff of autumn and the first ambitious icicle of January, our hardy pioneers faced a curious seasonal dilemma. Winter entertainment, with fields frozen, trails buried, and daylight sneaking off before supper. The frontier's sense of humor had to turn inward. And when you're snowed in with the same 4 people for 3 months, 2 of whom are geese named unnecessarily after Greek philosophers, entertainment becomes a matter of survival. Of course, frontier folks didn't exactly have Netflix, or radios, or libraries longer than 3 books, one of which was often the Sears catalogue, not originally intended as literature, but by candlelight, a surprisingly compelling read. Page 142 had a very well-worded ad for flannel nightgowns that got recited like Shakespeare by the end of January. After sundown, which in winter usually arrived somewhere around the time you finished your second potato, families would circle up around the hearth. The fire crackled like distant applause for putting up with another day in 3 layers of wool underpants. Grandpa might tell a true tale of his younger days, involving wolves, waist-deep snow, and how he once outran a bear using only determination and a half-stick of salted butter. These tales had a way of growing more impressive each winter. By 1875, the bear was practically running a business, supplying Grandpa with firewood. Storytelling wasn't just diversion. It was tradition, memory, and occasionally polite vengeance. Neighborly rivalries ended up immortalized in tales with thinly veiled aliases. You knew the mysterious Timothy the Lazy Blacksmith was actually Jeremiah from 2 homesteads over. Everyone did. Except, apparently, Jeremiah. In colder regions like the Montana Territory, where the snow fell like it had something to prove, impromptu theatricals became a thing. Families would assign roles from Mother Goose rhymes, biblical epics, or whatever cousin had scribbled dramatically onto spare paper like The Tragedy of Bessie and the Creaky Wagon Axle. Improvised stage curtains were hung from laundry lines. Characters were played with more spirit than rehearsal, and nobody noticed missed lines because nobody could hear over the firewood creaking in the stove like it too was trying to act. But for those truly frigid nights, the ones where stepping outside meant your eyelashes crispened and your nostrils waged war, the best entertainment came from games. Not the strategic, refined parlor pastimes of European nobility, of course, but rather rustic inventions like Button Button, Who's Got the Button, or the eternal classic, Guess What's in the Sack. The sack game was as mysterious as it was, well, literally a sack, with stuff in it, a potato, a rock, occasionally a spoon. The winner got exactly nothing, except momentary distraction and slightly improved tactile memory. Children, intoxicated by both cabin fever and surplus molasses, made up their own fun. One popular pastime involved tying each other to chairs, not for any sinister reason, just because knots were a skill, and frankly, options were limited. Some enterprising kids even held mock trials. Snow justice, they called it. Offences included misusing the butter churn or stealing more than your fair share of fireplace warmth. Punishments were severe but symbolic, usually involving wearing your mittens on your feet or apologizing dramatically to the family mule. For pioneers whose only stringed instrument had snapped its final chord somewhere around October, music still found a way. Voices joined in dusty ballads, old fiddle tunes hummed through cracked lips, and spoons, the instrument of the cold-heartedly creative, clacked rhythmically against any available knee. If a harmonica was present, it became the center of attention, its mournful tones somehow making the wind seem friendlier. And if the moon was generous, casting its blue winter light across the floorboards and the frost-laced window panes, families might step outside despite the temperature. They'd breathe clouds into the air, watch stars blink over white fields, and remember that beneath all the snowy inconvenience, they were rather small, marvelously and humbly small, against the quiet sprawl of the wild. All told, the pioneers didn't just survive the winter, they performed it. Each snowstorm was a new act, every woolen-clad evening a scene, and their audience was the dim flicker of the oil lamp and the occasional squirrel peeking through a log chink. And so, they passed the time with patience and performance, a touch of absurdity, and a deep appreciation for staying warm and mildly amused. As winter deepened and the provisions dwindled more slowly than the patience, our next gentle frontier mystery would begin, not with snowflakes or story games, but with the humble, crunchy rise of something altogether unexpected. Left beneath the floorboards, as the midwinter sun struggled to lift itself above the snow-capped ridges of Wyoming territory, the days unfurled like woolen scarves, slow, scratchy, and prone to catching fire if you stood too close to the stove. For our frontier folk, life in the cold was less about rugged heroism and more about strategic shivering and arguing over who forgot to plug the draft under the door again. Now, while tales of buckskin-clad heroes dashing through blizzards with sacks of flour strapped to their backs get all the glory, more common was the noble art of not going outside, a skill practiced with religious devotion every time snow threatened to seal the cabin shut, or when the thermometer dipped so low it could have been measuring morale instead of temperature. Indoors, families developed what we might call pioneer coziness, though it bore little resemblance to anything you'd see on a Pinterest board. Quilts were layered on beds like geological strata, each one a patchwork of warmth and whatever scraps Grandma could find that weren't already stuffed into the cracks in the wall. The fire was sacred, not warm enough to toast your toes, unless you risked igniting your long underwear, but just hot enough to convince everyone that frostbite was optional. Pioneer stoves, squat iron beasts with the personality of a badger and the appetite of a whale, were kept fed with cords of firewood that had, for the entire summer, been split by someone muttering bad language through a beard full of sawdust. Dinner in winter was necessarily creative. The word fresh became mythical around January. Instead, the menu leaned into culinary concepts such as reconstituted, somewhat preserved, and the ever-popular, we still have turnips. Beans were a staple, as were biscuits baked until they challenged your dental commitment. Dried apples, when soaked and stewed, morphed into something suspiciously close to dessert, or at least close enough if you squinted and had a forgiving attitude toward texture. Outside, the world belonged to the snow and the wind, who seemed to be playing an extended game of how loud can this get. The idea of going to the outhouse was greeted with the same enthusiasm as volunteer dental surgery. The journey there was a windswept epic, an Arctic expedition involving woolen layers, a lantern, and solemn goodbyes. A neighbor once tethered a rope from the back door to the privy so she could find her way back during blizzards. She also named the rope Hope, which felt overly dramatic until the snow erased the world in all directions. Children, resilient and slightly feral in the winter months, occupied themselves indoors with wooden toys, storytelling, and the ancient frontier pastime known as pestering siblings. A stick could be a sword, a doll, a horse, or the subject of a fierce custody battle that included at least one actual stick fight. Books, when available, were read aloud near the stove. Favorites included the Bible, second-hand almanacs, and occasionally a tattered copy of something by Charles Dickens. There is something deliciously ironic about reading Bleak House while literally living in one. Social entertainment was rare but not absent. If snow permitted and the moon was generous, neighbours might trudge several miles to partake in what was invariably called a frolic. Despite the lively name, most frolics involved modest dancing, warm beans, hot cider, and gossip, traded like currency. Nothing passed the time like discussing whose cow was surely pregnant and whose well water tasted suspiciously like hardship. And through all of this, through howling wind and frostbitten boots, through blue fingers that picked banjo strings and lips too cold to whistle, there remained a quiet resilience, not born of bravado, but of knowing that spring might be far off, but not farther than each other. The cold didn't just shape the land, it carved people like wind-etching stone into tougher, tenderer versions of themselves. Every blizzard endured was another page in the unwritten memoirs of everyday survival. So, as another snowbound morning creaked to life on its frosty hinges, and coffee boiled with the thin optimism of grounds reused one too many times, settlers stood at their windows, watched the smoke rise and said, if not aloud, then surely in spirit, well, at least it isn't colder. And with that flicker of pioneering optimism still glowing, we'll drift gently forward toward the next quiet marvel of this frozen frontier. When the mercury dropped below zero and promptly vanished from the thermometer altogether, frontier life underwent a curious transformation. In towns dotted across the snowy plains and nestled into the sides of frosted mountains, the rhythms of life slowed to a crawl, or perhaps more accurately, to a careful shuffle in 3 layers of wool and a squeaky pair of elk-hide mittens. They called it freeze season, a charmingly vague term that could mean anywhere from a couple weeks in a mild winter to 9 relentless months if the weather was feeling particularly vengeful. Once the chill settled in and all the garden vegetables officially lost their will to live, pioneers shifted into what can best be described as hibernation with chores. And that brings us, rather cozily, to the curious case of winter underpants. You see, pioneer winters weren't just cold. They were the kind of cold that made horses refuse to leave their stalls and prompted stews to freeze in the pot mid-simmer. In those times, personal insulation wasn't a fashion statement. It was a survival strategy. Long johns then were a mighty force indeed, stitched from wool or flannel and occasionally lined with a kind of hope that bordered on desperation. These garments were often put on in November and not removed until the spring thaw began to drip from the eaves. Entire friendships were built on mutual agreement not to ask when someone last changed their underlayers. Modesty, after all, had nothing on hypothermia. Inside the one-room cabins, families organized themselves by 2 rules. Keep the stove fed, and don't stray more than 6 feet from it. Wood-burning stoves became household obsessions, objects of near-religious devotion. Pioneer diaries are filled with tender laments over splitting logs in a blizzard, or poetic tragedies involving damp kindling and the eternal dance of trying to relight a fire when your moustache is frozen to your own lip. And it wasn't just the people who had to adapt. The animals, too, entered their own form of existential negotiation. Chickens refused to lay eggs unless bribed with warm mash. Cows wore woven blankets, often hilariously embroidered by children, because even Bessie deserved dignity. Cats, generally aloof creatures, tucked themselves behind warm stoves and developed a sudden, flattering affection for human legs, provided the legs were near the heat. The windows, many of them covered in a floral oilcloth that had once been a Sunday dress, frosted over until the outside world became a vague blur of snow, ice, and something that might have been the neighbor hauling firewood, or possibly an upright walking snowman. Venturing outdoors required preparation akin to expedition planning, not unlike preparing to cross the Antarctic, but with fewer sled dogs and significantly more internal grumbling. And yet, inside those cramped, creaking homes, winter had its own brand of cozy beauty. Nights stretched long and hushed, wind wheezing through chinks in the walls like a ghost with mild asthma. Families would gather around the stove, the orange light casting dancing shadows, and pass the time with storytelling, mending, and the complicated politics of shared quilts. When blankets weren't quite enough, folks piled up sleeping children like cordwood for extra warmth. It wasn't unusual for a grandmother, 2 toddlers, and a confused terrier to emerge from the same bedroll at dawn, breath fogging in unison like a snoozing steam engine. Entertainment came in the form of reading, by lamplight if you had oil, by memory if you didn't. Bible verses, folk tales, and speculation about whether spring would ever dare to return became staples of the season's conversations. Music, too, filtered through icy walls, fiddles squeaking through cold strings, voices harmonizing gently, not always in tune, but certainly in spirit. Of course, it wasn't all candlelit charm. Pipes froze at inopportune moments. Bread dough occasionally became sculpture. Ice crept inside the cabin walls with a persistence that made even the hardiest souls consider relocating to a slightly warmer hellscape, perhaps Missouri. But somehow they endured, reciting yarns, knitting socks, and occasionally laughing at the absurd reality of trying to make coffee while wearing 5 pairs of mittens. And so, as the snow piled higher and the stars outside gleamed like distant lanterns hung across the black prairie sky, the hearts of the homesteaders stayed just warm enough, wrapped in quilts, tradition, and a healthy distrust of January. Somewhere soon, though, there would rise the hope of a thaw, and the small miracle that was Frontier Laundry Day. But that's a frosty tale for another sleepy moment. By the time January's second week grumbled in, with icicles long enough to apply for dual weapons and winds whistling in keys yet undiscovered by man, our pioneer settlers had found themselves developing unexpected expertise in the highly underappreciated art of doing absolutely nothing. You see, when it's so cold that your eyelids risk freezing shut mid-blink, you begin to reevaluate your ambitions. Chopping wood sounds a bit ambitious. Riding into town, only if your horse is part woolly mammoth. Instead, most folks surrendered to winter's lullaby, indoors, bundled up, and deeply, profoundly bored, which led to, of course, a surge in what historians now politely call domestic creativity. Take, for example, the Johnson family, whose patriarch decided to teach the children Shakespeare, using only the parts he could remember, and replacing words he'd forgotten with sound effects. So the classic line became, "To be or not to be?" Thwomp, that is the question. Interpretations varied. Or the McCrearys down the road, who initiated a competitive sock darning tournament, judged by whichever relative happened to be nearest the candle. Bets were made, pride was wounded, and by month's end, an underground league had formed, with hand-sewn emblems and everything. In absence of outdoor activities, storytelling emerged as the wintertime Olympics of the frontier. Around fireplaces across the wild, wind-beaten plains, lips flapped faster than hens startled by a coyote in church shoes. Stories were currency, and the taller they were, the richer their teller. Grandfathers spoke of blizzards so fierce they froze a man standing mid-step for weeks, a convenient excuse for any delays in chores. Middle-aged farmers recalled the Great Cow Stampede of '78, which consisted of one confused heifer and a barn door left ajar, but was now recounted with the gravitas of a classical epic, complete with falling meteors and synchronized bovine choreography. And the children, perhaps the most creative of all, invented snowbound games that defied logic and patience. One favorite was Frozen Face, in which they'd race outside without coats, see who could make the most dramatic shivering noises, and run back inside before frostbite could nibble any toes. A curious balance of daring and deeply questionable decision-making. Meanwhile, inside the walls of the humble pioneer cabins, something fascinating was happening. The cold had a way of knitting people together, sometimes quite literally, under scratchy patchwork quilts, sewn with the fierce urgency of frost. Families that barely had time to speak during the bustling planting seasons now found themselves rediscovering each other's personalities, an occasionally pleasant, occasionally alarming revelation. Quiet Pa, for instance, who'd spent most of the year staring at mules and muttering about crop yield, revealed a deep passion for whittling wooden ducks, not useful, not even attractively shaped, but pursued with earnest intensity. Little Ellie carved baked bean cans into candle holders, not safe, absolutely not fire marshal approved, but charming in a sort of frontier industrial aesthetic. The Glenroths next door even held a shadow puppet theatre behind an old flour sack, dramatizing the courtship of a porcupine and a snowshoe hare. Did it make sense? Not even remotely. But the applause was thunderous. Well, as thunderous as 7 pairs of mittened hands can manage. For all their stoicism and calloused hands, these winter-weary pioneers had stumbled upon a treasured, if slightly absurd, truth. When stripped of endless tasks and distractions, people have an astonishing gift for turning nothing into something cozy, something meaningful, or at the very least, something magnificently silly. Of course, not everything was cheer and twine dancing. Supplies were rationed like secrets in a soap opera. The beans were thinner than an honest politician, and the coffee was so reused that it developed its own flavor notes, burnt leather and misplaced dreams. But even in that, there was a peculiar comfort. Communities leaned into one another. If your butter froze solid, you knew Mrs. Callahan would have a solution involving a heated horseshoe, a tin cup, and a folk song only she could recall. If your chimney smoked backwards, 3 neighbors would show up with ladders, contradictory advice, and a pie that somehow tasted only slightly like pine. Winter was not comfortable. It was not glamorous. But in those frozen hours, wrapped in wool and whimsy, the settlers made warmth from their own stubborn hearts and oddball ingenuity. And as the wind sighed like an old man half dreaming and half complaining, the people of the prairie did what they'd done best. Not just survive the freeze, but quietly, fantastically thrive in spite of it. Somewhere out there, a kettle began to whistle, gently, steadily, as if warming up for the next evening's tales. As the brutal western winter slackened just enough to stop frosting eyelashes shut mid-blink, the pioneers of the plains began another beloved and deeply questionable tradition: spring cleaning, Frontier Edition. You may be picturing genteel ladies airing lace curtains and shooing away dust motes with lavender-scented fans. Ah, no. Spring cleaning on the mid-19th century American frontier was less Downton Abbey and more, how shall we put it, burn the mattress and hope it kills the lice. After surviving months of bitter cold, half-frozen jerky, and indoor cows who'd overstayed their welcome, pioneers attempted to reclaim their cabins from an ecosystem of filth that could legally apply for homesteading rights. You see, in winter, you didn't go outside unless something was on fire. And even then, you considered carefully whether the fire was really that bad. As a result, any notion of tidiness fell victim to sheer survival. But once the snow began to melt and the door could be opened without an ice pick, something stirred inside the average settler. Perhaps it was a spark of optimism. Perhaps it was the mild threat of rodents unionizing. Either way, it was time to freshen things up. Airing out the pioneer cabin was quite the event, and by airing out, we mostly mean opening the door and windows while praying. A blizzard doesn't sneak back in. There may not have been vanilla candles or essential oil diffusers, but nothing woke you up like the smell of melting snow, damp wood, and horse. It was like nature's version of Febreze, but with more manure. Bedding, such as it was, straw-stuffed ticks lined with old quilts, were dragged unceremoniously outside. This wasn't merely for hygiene. It was also to shake out any uninvited guests who had taken winter lodging in your sleep layers. Lice, fleas, and the occasional spider the size of a button all got their eviction notices on spring cleaning day. If the cats didn't chase them off, the wind usually did. Clothing, too, began its reluctant return to cleanliness. Pioneers often possessed precisely two outfits: everyday wear and slightly cleaner everyday wear. These were beaten with sticks, washed in Chilli Creek water, and then shamefully reassembled into the same grim overalls. But the important thing was trying. Children were scrubbed next, with actual soap if you had some, or at least a clean clump of snow. Imagine years going by where your idea of a spa day is someone yelling, "Stand still," while they chip last week's grits out of your hair with a soup spoon. More hopeful than effective, sweeping was also part of the ritual. Pioneers would swab their dirt floors, not with the goal of getting them clean, but of reminding the floor who was in charge. Soil was smoothed over, straw replaced for softness, and wooden planks, if you were lucky, were re-nailed with stern looks and heavier boots. The privy, or more accurately, the hole in the backyard blessed with a pleasing breeze, was also finally mucked out, ideally before children turned it into a springtime sledding hazard. Contrary to popular belief, the outhouse was not immune to seasonal maintenance. Rotting boards could collapse at inopportune moments, and no one on the prairie wanted to start their day with a sudden plunge into the icy depths of misjudged carpentry. As spring tidying commenced, so too came the seasonal reintegration of actual neighbors. Men and women who'd kept to their cabins all winter reappeared like very pale bears, blinking in the sunlight and proudly showing off the few teeth that had survived the cold. Visits resumed. There were potluck dinners featuring foods that weren't root vegetables, and conversations that didn't begin with, "Is that frostbite, or are you just unhappy to see me?" And so, with the scent of new grass beneath their feet, and last October's turnips finally gone mushy enough to throw out, the frontier colonies surfaced from hibernation, with clothes no cleaner, but attitudes slightly brighter. Hope had thawed, slowly, like molasses shipped from back east, thick, sweet, and determined. Somehow, it always seemed miraculous that after months of sunless monotony and frostbitten everything, these sod-roofed fortresses of determination burst back to life. The cleanup, ridiculous as it often seemed, was a form of ritual, a brushing away of the cold's ghosts, a symbolic declaration that the earth might still bear something green, and that, for better or worse, life would go on. Warm winds were whispering through the prairie grasses now, and with a cabin swept, if not fully cleansed, the attention of the settlers turned to something else entirely. Something stirring on the horizon, something that always came after snow. Calves, ploughs, seeds, and the greatest gamble of all, spring planting. As winter crept over the western frontier like a white bear curling into hibernation, something miraculous and mildly absurd began to unfold in the small town of Calico, a forgotten speck tucked into the snowy hush of Wyoming territory. The townsfolk, having long resigned themselves to the icebox reality of frontier winters, found an unlikely source of warmth and entertainment in a new arrival. A Swedish immigrant named Gustav Ålander, a man whose gourmet skill set existed wildly out of context in a place where fine dining meant stew without weevils. Gustav had arrived by sled, pulled by 2 donkeys that looked profoundly unhappy about their life choices. Clad in knits that could stop a bullet, he carried with him a cast-iron stove, a locked tin of mysterious spices, and a fiercely guarded waffle recipe that locals would later revere more than Holy Scripture. You see, Gustav wasn't just a traveling cook. He was a wizard of carbohydrates and oils, and, though nobody said it aloud yet, he might be the town's last hope for not freezing to death from the inside out. It began when he started serving hot waffles every Sunday morning in the town's half-church, half-blacksmith shop. Now, you might be wondering how waffles can prevent frontier hypothermia, and to that, I say, clearly, you've never held a warm, syrup-drenched breakfast item while standing inside a building with no insulation and 23 holes in its walls. Gustav called them värmevåfflor, literally warmth waffles in Swedish, which sounds much more poetic when muttered through a frostbitten mustache. He served them with a ladle of molten butter, a sprinkle of dried cranberries, and if you were lucky, a slice of smoked hare he'd cured on his sled during transit. It was not cuisine in any formal sense, but in Calico, it was warming, filling, and, most importantly, highly smotherable in maple syrup. The ritual of Sunday waffles soon became a social institution. Pioneer families would stagger in through drifts of snow 3 children deep, stomping the frost off their boots and holding up frozen fingers to accept a hot, golden square of despair-killing comfort. Marriages were proposed over waffles. Deals were brokered. One gentleman, known only as Shirtless Walter, finally agreed to wear sleeves after 3 consecutive Sundays of shivering near the stove and spilling syrup down his arms. Gustav's influence grew in other quiet ways. His insistence on cleanliness in the shared spatulas inspired a hygiene revolution, albeit on a limited scale. For the first time in recorded Calico history, someone voluntarily washed a dish that wasn't theirs. Mrs. Prudence Featheringale shed a tear when she witnessed it. "It's like civilization is sprouting again," she whispered, before sneaking a 3rd waffle under her bonnet. During the week, Gustav continued his culinary experiments, building up the pantry with smoked fish, root vegetable pastries, and other inventive concoctions meant to combat both scurvy and boredom. Overnight, the town's previously ironclad hierarchy, with the blacksmith at the top, and the man who once wrestled a moose into a barn behind him began to shift. Food, it turned out, was power. But it wasn't just the food. No, what Gustav brought was warmth in the metaphysical sense. The settlers were hardened, but not made of stone. A hot meal served with a wink and incomprehensible Scandinavian mumblings had a way of softening even the frostiest dispositions. Grudges melted faster than sleet on skillet iron. Children began icing sleds with lard for extra velocity. Even the livestock, inspired by the rising optimism in the air, started misbehaving with renewed vigor. That winter, Calico recorded fewer cases of frostbite, fewer altercations over buffalo jerky, and for the first time, 0 incidents of someone challenging a snowdrift to a duel. As the days grew longer and February's frigid grip began to loosen, the townsfolk gathered by the stove not just for waffles, but for gossip, laughter, and the slowly unraveling comfort of knowing spring would eventually arrive, and that it might even be delicious. And so, Gustav became a legend, not by heroism or heroic incompetence, as was more typical out west, but by crafting cozy mornings that stretched across long, bitter months, like a woven quilt of buttery kindness. The freeze would break soon, though it never really announced its departure. It just quietly slipped away, much like the steam from Gustav's final weekly batch of vermivoflor. But before the rivers cracked open and wagons rolled again, there was one final winter rite to perform. A strange gathering at twilight, centered around ice, mischief, and a competitive game involving frozen trousers. As the brittle winds of February traced scratchy runes across the windows of prairie cabins, one truth stood firm in the hearts of every pioneer clinging to warmth by the glow of a wood-burning stove. Winter was not a season. It was a personality test. Out there, somewhere between frostbite and fortitude, the people of the frontier invented entire philosophies from boredom. After all, there are only so many times you can whittle a spoon before you start wondering about the purpose of spoons or whether the cows are judging your carpentry. And so, they invented games, glorious in their simplicity. These diversions usually had vague rules, no scoring whatsoever, and a suspiciously high rate of cheating, often committed with such polite discretion that everyone agreed to pretend they hadn't noticed. Take Button Button, Who's Got the Button? A thrilling drama of misplaced sewing supplies, or Shut the Box, a dice game suspiciously resembling accounting. There was also endless delight in playing Count the Things Inside the Cabin That Have Frozen, though admittedly the conclusion was always everything, including Uncle Elmer. In certain circles, storytelling became an Olympic sport. Each winter tale grew taller than the previous, and by the time the snow began to melt, every settler in a 10-mile radius was personally acquainted with a bear who could open doors, read psalms, and possibly play the fiddle. Whether anyone ever invited this bear for supper remained a source of regional debate. But perhaps the finest winter tradition of all was cataloguing, pioneer complaints, a rich oral history passed from frozen lips directly into cultural legacy. My biscuits are so hard you could tile a roof with them. The wind blew clean through the wall and shaved my chin. My breath froze in the air and fell into my coffee. My eyelids froze shut during church. Best nap I ever had. These were not so much grievances as performance art. The louder and more exaggerated your complaint, the more respect you earned, like a blizzard-themed poetry slam judged by grumpy grandmas. Because when the mercury dropped faster than a greased anvil, what else could you do but laugh? Grim determination could only get you so far. Humor, you see, was the horse that pulled the sleigh. Of course, true resourcefulness was the backbone of pioneer survival, and nowhere was that more evident than on laundry day. Yes, laundry. Doing the wash in the middle of a plains winter was an act requiring physical stamina, mechanical cunning, and the spiritual elegance of a monk. With water freezing faster than your intentions, many families resorted to something called freeze drying, an advanced frontier technique whereby your clean clothes froze stiff on the line like denim popsicles. Frozen shirts clinked in the wind like haunted wind chimes, and petticoats took on the shape of their owner, leading to several alarming prairie sightings of what looked like an army of ghostly fashion mannequins marching toward the barn. Yet the settlers pressed on, adapting to frozen stoves, frigid boots, and jam jars so cold they could only be opened with a chisel. And somehow, through sheer stubbornness and community potlucks, they made it. Speaking of potlucks, midwinter cabin feasts were more than meals. They were morale operations coated in gravy. Every casserole, jellied salad, and beef tongue aspic was a gesture of shared suffering and mutual digestion. People didn't just bring food, they brought hope, wrapped in wax, paper, and garnished with an earnest pickle. After supper, the fiddles came out. It's often said that pioneers couldn't dance worth a hoot. That's because their boots were 10 pounds each, and the dance floor was, invariably, an icy patch next to the woodpile. But spirits ran high, and so did the knees, even when the dance jig threatened to pull one's back into the year 1846. Sleep, at last, crept in like a wool blanket with opinions. Families curled beneath layers so thick they could barely move, resembling stacks of pancakes moving slightly with each breath. The wind howled, coyotes yipped in the black distance, and bed warmers steamed faintly beneath quilts that had seen 3 generations of elbows. Even the mice fell silent, or perhaps they were frozen to the wainscoting. Either way, hush blanketed the claim, and the stars glittered like ice diamonds above. Tomorrow, the sun would rise, maybe not warmly, but with the polite insistence of someone knocking at the door, with a shovel and a sense of obligation. But for now, the cabin slept, dreams mingling with chimney smoke and the creak of timbers contracting in cold contentment. All was still, and nearly, almost spring. And so, with winter's breath settling like a sleepy sigh across the prairie, we tiptoe into the final flickers of pioneer life's frost-bitten lantern light. By 1890, the official American frontier was declared closed, at least by someone in a buttoned-up office in Washington, D.C., who, quite frankly, hadn't spent much time digging a frozen privy pit in dead January. The pioneers, meanwhile, were still out there, clearing snow blocks from barn doors, boiling water with wood that crackled like it held grudges, and inventing approximately 127 ways to make beans palatable after 6 months without fresh produce. It wasn't glamorous, it rarely smelled good, but it had heart, and it had an awful lot of wool. Communities, stitched together by survival and stovepipe, gossip, were beginning to feel less like desperate outposts and more like towns with awkward middle children. The first telephones arrived in fits and starts, often installed by enterprising blacksmiths who figured if they could pummel hot iron into horseshoes, surely they could wrangle wires. Conversations, once shared over fence posts and beef stew, now beeped uncertainly over large wooden boxes that considered privacy optional. Winter remained the great equalizer. No matter whether you were the local mayor or a cabbage farmer with calloused hands and dreams of pickles, you still had to keep your toes warm. The mail still froze solid if you didn't sprint it inside. and the woodpile still ran out on the day your cousin from Omaha decided to winter over, claiming to be allergic to work. By now, January evenings had taken on a particular rhythm. Lamps hissed softly from their mantles. Soup simmered like it was plotting something, and families gathered near the stove to tune into the most important entertainment of the season, Grandpa's fifth retelling of the blizzard of '73. He never let facts get in the way of snowdrift sizes or a feisty mule's bravery, bless him. As more families built homes better insulated than a squirrel's dreams, women's journals began recommending such avant-garde activities as rest, reading books, making lace, playing cards indoors instead of shoveling outhouses. Well, not entirely instead, but with more balance. Children, elongated by milk and invincibility, built accidental legends. One local boy outside of Helena thought he could ski behind a sleigh using only 2 barrel staves and a rope. He did it once. The rope snapped. He didn't. But now there's a signpost in his honor, and a tree with a very mild dent. And yet, for all its mishaps and mittens, the last breaths of early pioneer winters came with a funny sort of romance, the kind born not of ease, but of resilience. Snow dances in the dark, lantern-lit windows in a storm. Hot water poured over icy hinges to free the barn door before the cow declares mutiny. Couples wrapped in Afghans and contradictions, dancing in kitchens to fiddles that may or may not be in tune, while snow stacked up like poorly organized laundry. Mail order catalogs began to arrive more reliably, and for the first time, folks could order winter coats with options: wool with buttons, or, if you were terribly modern, fur-lined with something promisingly called pocket flaps. Whether or not the pockets actually flapped was beside the point. It sounded progressive. Not all homesteaders remained. Some gave up and returned east, fleeing winters so aggressive they had personalities. But for those who stayed, those who managed to coax crops from frozen ground and laughter from frozen lips, well, they built something not just of land, but of law. By the end of that era, the snow seemed less like an enemy and more like a cranky but respected roommate. You didn't love it, but you baked for it out of courtesy. As the chill winds mellowed into the calm of understanding, many of those brave families began to pass down more than just long johns. They passed down stories stitched from icicles and iron wills, quilts that had outlived 3 generations, recipes that started as survival and matured into cuisine, albeit with suspiciously repetitive ingredients. So here we are, fellow dreamer, tucked in among memories of frost-laced windows and wood smoke that settled deeper than any perfume. The spell of the cold West, wrapped in buffalo robes, survives not in textbooks, but in the way your fingers feel against hot cider after a walk through snow. Close your eyes now. Let the echo of wagons fade. The wind is whispering through the pines, and it's telling you everything survived, even you. Good night, pioneer.